Hello, we're going to talk about basic mathematical review in chapter 2. I'll also be doing a quick refresher on how to do things in Excel dealing with formulas. Let's have a look. Again, chapter 2 deals with the mathematics review. I'll leave it to you to read what the learning objectives are, but most of them are things that we've basically done in earlier math classes. Fractions are basically one or more part of a whole. So if we split something in half, it has two parts, and the number of those parts is the top number, called the numerator. The bottom number, of course, is the denominator, and these can run the gamut. Here it is 3/5. 3 is the number of parts, which in this case is split into 5, a denomination of 5, if you will. When we talk about a quotient, we're talking about a number that's obtained by dividing the numerator of a fraction by the denominator. And this is what gives us a fraction put into decimal places. So in our example of 3/5, we see it as 0.6. That 0.6 is the quotient. It's the number that you get when you divide the top number by the bottom number. In other words, dividing the numerator by the denominator. Decimal fractions are basically taking a fraction and putting it into the Dewey Decimal System, right? So in this number in the second bullet point, we have 14.37. So in other words, we have a 14, which is the whole number, and 37 1/100ths, right? So the digits that are to the right, if you will, of this decimal point, right there, are the decimal digits. And we say carry out to two decimal places or what have you. That's what we're talking about. And the decimal system is basically a way of separating that whole number 14 from the fraction part of it, which is the 0.37. So what 14.37 means, there's 14 whole parts and 0.37 fraction parts. And again, 0.5 is usually written as 0.5. And this is a big thing in hospital records. And on abbreviation list, going back to when we had handwritten records, they would require these types of things so people wouldn't give the wrong medication dosage, right? So in this case, in the last bullet point, 0.5, usually written as 0.5, is the same as 0.50, which is 50 100ths, which is essentially 50% or 1/2. This is something we've reviewed many years ago, I'm sure all of us. We have the thousands. Typically, there's a comma after that. The hundreds, the tens, the ones, everything to the right of the ones are the decimals, and the first digit is the tenths, followed by hundredths, followed by thousandths, followed by 10,000. Another thing that we deal with is rounding numbers. And basically, this is taking something that was a fraction and rounding it up to the nearest whole number, the nearest 10, the nearest 100. And we'll take a look at a couple of examples here. 31 is greater than 30, but it's less than 40. It's closer to 30 than it is 40. So if we were to round it, we would round it to 30 because it's closer. 37, on the other hand, is greater than 30, but less than 40. It is closer to 40, so we'd round it up. So as it says in the third bullet point, if you're asked to round to the nearest 10, 31 is rounded to 30, and 37 gets rounded up to 40. The most logical thing would be anything that's between 35 and 39 would go up, of course. And anything between 34 and 31 goes down to 30. So that leaves the question, what do we do with 35? Well, when two numbers are exactly the same between the two multiples, we generally round up unless otherwise specified, as it says here in the third bullet point. And as it says here on this slide, we can extend this in groups of 100, 1,000, 10,000. The logic is basically the same. And of course, the number 7,868, it's between 7,800 and 7,900. So if we were to round up to the nearest hundredth, excuse me, we would round it to 7,900. And again, as we said before, if it's exactly halfway, right? If we were to round in multiples of 1,000th, as it says in the second bullet point, and we have 7,500, we round up unless otherwise specified. So it becomes 8,000. And that's all I have for you. We'll be coming back and talking about more about converting fractions to decimals in just a little bit. Bye now.